Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics. And in today's tutorial, we'll be breaking down the process of how to draw a human heart. Now, because the human heart is quite abstract looking due to its compact structure with various arteries, aortas, and veins, we want to make sure that we use a visual diagram to assist us in the drawing process. And the way in which we're going to start this is by drawing an outline of the human heart. So try and use a reference image. There is one in the article, and we're going to simply start by drawing the structure of the human heart in an outline form. So with our HB pencils, what we can do is we can establish a circle on the page just to scale the heart. And now the heart is kind of made up of two main sections, which is the bottom section, which consists of the left and right ventricle. And obviously, since we'll be drawing the heart encased in its collagenous sac, we won't necessarily need to draw its cross-sectional details, showing all the ventricles and arteries and how they overlap and connect to one another inside the heart. So the way in which we can do this is we can draw this main bottom section, which is kind of acorn shaped, and this encapsulates the left and right ventricle, whereas the top section is going to be more exposed and show how the tube-like features of the heart become more visible, such as the superior vena cava, the right atrium, the aorta, the pulmonary trunk, and the left atrium. So we will see that the left and right ventricle, or the encasing, the collagenous encasing that covers the right and left ventricle, kind of narrows into the pulmonary trunk. From there, we'll see that tucked under the pulmonary trunk is the left atrium, and this kind of has a brain-like quality. We'll also see that the pulmonary veins poke outwardly just behind the left atrium, whereas the aorta is the larger tube that is placed directly above the pulmonary trunk. Now, this is why we want to have a heart diagram, because as I go through the labeling of these different features, it will just be helpful for you to understand that which features I'm describing and how exactly they're placed. That being said, as I carry on, we'll also find that the superior vena cava is more vertical shaped, and this is placed directly next to the aorta. So we just want to kind of work out this basic outline. I want you to spend some time just working on the outline, making sure that the bottom of the heart has this acorn-like shape, and you lightly just sketching in the main tube-like structures that are parts of the heart. Now, once we have a general outline, we can now start moving on to working in some light shading. And this is where we start to give this heart structure a little bit more three-dimensionality. So now that we understand that the heart is broken up into two main sections, we want to first work in some detailing into the bottom section of the heart. And this is where we add in some vein-like structures. We can imagine these vein-like structures looking a little bit like roots of a tree as they flow along the surface of the left and right ventricle, or the encasing of the left and right ventricle. These vein-like structures can also overlap each other, and this is going to give it a little bit more of a realistic quality, as veins tend to have this webbing-like quality where they overlap one another, especially in the case of the heart, as veins kind of flow over the encasing, the collagenous encasing that covers the left and right ventricle. So we want to make sure that they're also slightly narrowed down and branch out as they move towards the bottom of the heart. Now, once we have done this, we can start to work in a little bit of shading with a mid-tone pencil like a 2B and a 3B. And this is where we want to start working on giving some three-dimensionality to the tube-like structures. So we're going to work a lot with our pencils and erasers, slowly refining these features by just kind of working along the edging, where we start to work in some shading to give some three-dimensional form to each tube. Try to imagine it as if you're working shading from the edging of each of these tube-like structures, and you want to kind of create a gradient from dark to light. By doing this, working shading from dark to light, we make the edges slightly darker of each tube-like structure, and then to the center, as we come to the center area of each tube-like structure, the shading starts to get slightly lighter, and this kind of gives kind of a shiner effect to the muscle-like quality, organ-like quality that is the aesthetic of these veins and ventricles and aortas. So we want to make sure we're kind of creating this shiny surface on each of these tube-like structures, and this is going to give the heart a little bit more of a realistic quality. As we also look at the reference image, we can see that as we move through each tube-like structure, going from the left atrium to the pulmonary trunk and coming to the superior vena cava, we will see that most of these tube-like structures kind of have a cavity that runs through them. So we can draw these cavities or darken these cavities by making a circular shape at the ends of each of these tube-like structures. And this is just going to kind of bring a visual quality that just describes the hollow nature of each tube. Now let's proceed with our shading, and again what we want to do is we want to make sure that for each tube-like structure, whether it's the superior vena cava, the right atrium, the pulmonary trunk, and so on, we want to make sure that our shading is creating a gradient that moves from the edges of each tube. And basically what we would like to do is shift that gradient from dark to light from the edges of each tube and lighten the center of each tube. Again, we want to just make sure that we are describing a three-dimensional quality in each of these tubes, and by shading darker on the edges and lighter in the center of each tube, we kind of define the curvature, which is obviously synonymous with a tube-like structure. We want to make sure that we spend time on shading the heart structure and make sure that obviously we are working in this mid or light tone of shading throughout the entire heart. So we want to make sure that we are looking at this reference image and making sure that we are establishing a light layer of shading, and this way it will make it easier once we start adding in darker shading. We can also start adding some shading into the actual lower section of the heart where the right ventricle and the left ventricle is located. And I would say that a good suggestion is to spend some time adding in some shading in between each of these veins. Again, we want to obviously create more three-dimensionality in the structure, and this means that we want to add shading to all aspects, including the small details such as the veins that run along the surface of the left and right ventricle. Now make sure you take your time establishing a light layer of shading with pencil, because we are going to move on to using ballpoint pen. It isn't necessarily a difficult shading process, as the pencil shading should set up a guideline of where we will add in our pen shading. We just want to make sure that we have established tonal ranges within the heart where we can see where we would add in darker shading, or where we would obviously keep the heart slightly light, or where the highlights would be located within the heart. And with the left and right ventricle, we want to make sure that that encasing, or that collagenous encasing, obviously has some shine to it because of its glassy texture. So we definitely want to make sure that we're working in both light and dark shading within the ventricle area of the heart. Now once we have established the heart, we understand that the upper area of the heart has these tubes. We know where exactly to add in some darker shading. We have established all the features. We're now going to move on to working with ballpoint pen. So ballpoint pen doesn't necessarily need to be daunting. Again, we're going to use the pencil lines to guide us, and we're going to start in the upper section of the heart. We want to make sure that we really work on these glassy details in the heart, and this is where we're going to emphasize that shading gradients from the edges of each tube-like structure, and slowly lightening our shading as we come to these center areas of each tube-like structure. So using your ballpoint pen, we want to start really drawing or filling in those cavities that are exposed at the ends of each tube where we can see they hollowed out, and we want to start working in some ballpoint pen outlines where we can start establishing gradients of shading from dark to light, using our pencil shading to guide us as we go. This drawing process, we really want to make sure we take our time and slowly work in these pen details, pen shading details from the top section of the heart into the lower section of the heart. Now we just want to make sure that as we proceed with the shading process, we're using the pencil lines to guide us. Now we want to make sure that we obviously spend a good portion of time on both sections of the heart, and that means we really want to make sure that as we shade in all these tube-like structures on the top section of the heart, we really want to make sure that we are working in these gradients, really shading over those pencil lines and taking our time so we can create seamless gradients within each tube-like structure. Now, as we build up layers with our ballpoint pen shading in these different tube-like structures, we can also start working out how we can create a tonal variety between these different features. So for instance, the aorta, we want to make sure that there are moments that are darker and lighter because of its curved nature. And this is obviously going to establish some sort of subtle shadowing at the curved areas that kind of fall under the top arc of the aorta's shape. And the same goes for the left atrium. We want to at least think a little bit about like how these tube-like structures might sit or overlap one another, or how some of these features might be a little bit more present in the foreground and some might be a little present in the background. So for the pulmonary veins, we can make them slightly darker as they sit more behind the heart in the background. With the left atrium, we can make it slightly darker as it sits underneath the pulmonary trunk. And for the aorta, we can see that there's a subtle curve in the aorta, and we just want to make sure that we're creating this gradient between dark to light as this curve shifts into a more exposed area, or as some of its surface area becomes more exposed. As you spend time on the upper section, we just want to make sure that we spend a good portion of time, and this way we can start to create these subtle tonal varieties, just to create a more three-dimensionality within the heart drawing and to create distinctions between areas that are highlighted or lit up slightly more than other areas that might fall in the background or placed underneath larger tube-like structures. Anyways, as we carry on with this shading process, we can start flowing into the bottom section of the heart drawing, and this is where we start getting into shading the ventricles and the veins. We want to make sure that we start on a more shaded side of the ventricles, and this is where we start adding some darker shading near the right side. Near the right side of the heart, that encasing that covers the left ventricle is going to have a slightly more darker shading. As the right ventricle becomes slightly more exposed, that surface area becomes slightly lighter. So we just want to keep this in mind as we create shading and tonal variations within this bottom section of the heart. Another important aspect as we shade in the lower section of the heart is to work with the veins. Now, these little veins and arteries, these smaller details, we really want to make sure that we're taking our time focusing on how to create, again, little gradients of dark to light shading even within these smaller details. With the little veins, another good suggestion is to work shading in between the veins. So this is how the veins sit on the heart, and we just want to kind of darken or outline the veins on one side to kind of establish shadowing that falls along one side of the veins. If we create shadowing, this small shadowing or shadowed areas along one single side of each vein, we have a little bit more of a realistic three-dimensional quality, because what we are doing is we are keeping a consistency on which side the shadows would fall on all the veins. So take your time with this process. Again, we really want to just make sure that we are building up these pen layers slowly. We don't want to rush into making dark marks. By doing so, we are more likely to make a mistake, especially when it comes to shading with ballpoint pen. But we can spend a good portion of time now on the lower section of the heart near the ventricles, slowly establishing shading around the outline of the heart. As we shade in the left and right ventricle, we also want to make sure that we are leaving a little more lighter, less contrast or less dark shading in the center area of the right ventricle. And by doing so, we're kind of creating this aspect of, again, three-dimensionality, creating some sort of highlight or a softer, lighter tonal value on the surface area that would be more exposed to a light source. Again, we can use this reference image to guide us, But the process now is simply about adding these layers of shading. Try to really think, a really good suggestion is to think about your ballpoint pen as a pencil. And this is because ballpoint pens are really good for shading because their ink comes out quite sparingly, which means that they kind of work similar to pencils. So the way in which we kind of control and govern the amounts of shading or the darkness of shading is by the amount of pressure we apply to the pen. And this is particularly important for creating gradients. This is why we want to kind of establish these dark to light gradients in different areas or in different features of the heart by building up layers by layers. And as we build up these lighter layers, we can slightly harden the pressure that we apply to our pens and slowly build up darker layers near the edging or the outline of the ventricles. But the intention here is to really make sure that these edgings and bottom sections that would be least exposed to light would be darker, and as they come into the central area of the ventricles, they become slightly lighter due to that surface area being more exposed to a light source. But other than this, really take your time, really just spend a good portion of time building up these layers, and that is the basic process of how to draw a human heart. I hope this tutorial is really helpful and informative. I think given what has been said, you can take it from here. You can work with the tools that you have learned and apply them to your own drawing. Otherwise, from us, please like, please subscribe, stay tuned, and we will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.